Hi, everybody. So we're going to move on to the next section of the argument for Catholicism from reality. And what we're going to do in this section is we're going to begin by exploring some of the same areas that we were describing in Protestantism, but to look at them through the lens of Orthodoxy and Catholicism. These areas in Protestantism that we have just explored are the intellectual streams of Protestantism, such as the Lutheran tradition and the Calvinism and so on and so forth. We describe the behavioral traditions like the Amish in the past and the social justice movements of the current times. We described the different experiential streams, such as the Shakers and Quakers and the modern Pentecostals and Charismatics. We looked at these different levels, and we saw ways in which Protestantism seemed to have fragmented ways of dealing with the human faculties, of engaging with the fullness of what it means to be human. And we saw that different methods of trying to bring them together, whether through some kind of broad scheme of ecumenism, through the experiences of a common shared experience, like Pentecostalism, or something like the more structured Anglican synthesis, really don't lead to a coherent integration of all these different faculties and capacities. And so now we're going to see, what do Orthodoxy and Catholicism have to bring to this territory? And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at how the Orthodox and the Catholics deal with these territories. Now, let's slow down and look at this difference. In Orthodoxy, there is a very strong emphasis on a kind of sobriety. There's this leaning heavily toward mystery. I often think of the best metaphor for Orthodoxy being a cave. A cave is mysterious and hollow, but it's in the rock. It's deep. And, if we want to extend this metaphor, inside the cave, you don't need your senses. Your senses are not going to be used very much because it's dark. You're not going to be using your sight. You might be using your touch, going along. But you probably need to yell out to somebody in there, hey, which way do I go? You might need a light, So there's this element of this, that you might need like a torch, which, that's prayer. So that's what you need in this thing. But they don't trust the other faculties. They don't trust the other things. They don't trust emotional or sensory experiences. They stay close to prayer like a torch in that cave. Close to prayer, self-restraint, penance, self-discipline, and contrition. You see this throughout Orthodox spirituality. They're very cautious. Again, they don't use imagination. They are very concerned about falling into spiritual delusion and pride, especially what they call prelest or spiritual delusion. And in fact, this is why many times when they look at Catholicism, they see a lack of sobriety. They claim that Catholic saints are, they don't say this many times because they are more charitable, but their arguments imply that the Catholic saints are deluded by demons. So they basically say that the Catholics are imagining things, that our spirituality is too fleshly, that we are actually all in delusion and caught up in our faculties like imagination. And this is not a small disagreement. This is a fundamental difference in how the faculties are used and the amount of freedom we should give to our emotions and our trust. And what this leads to is a sense that because in the Orthodox tradition they see this kind of openness, this kind of trusting and familiar nature that we have with God in the Western traditions of spirituality, they see that as all delusion. That's all delusory. That's a bad thing. Now, that is the difference. So we saw in Protestantism this kind of fragmentation and specialization in the faculties. Whereas we see in Orthodoxy a kind of withdrawal from the faculties, especially, we see this kind of, we're not using the intellect, we're not using the behavior, we're not using experience fully. We're kind of withdrawing from those and we're kind of specializing in what is above them, which is the noetic faculty, the prayer faculty. We're going to specialize there. And so that is really the place where it's all rooted, is in this sense of prayer And that's really where we're going to be. And so we're going to use that kind of in opposition to the others. We're not going to really go further into those things. And it doesn't mean that there's no intellect. There's a lot of intellectual stuff in Orthodoxy, but there is this deep sense that we don't want a rationalism. And there's this accusation that in the Catholic and Protestant traditions, there's a kind of rationalism. And so they will say, especially in things like the tradition of Vladimir Lossky, there's this kind of understanding where there's a kind of anti-intellectualism that you'll find, especially in later Orthodox writers, that isn't present necessarily in people like St. Gregory Palamas, but there is ultimately this sense that the West is about thinking that we could somehow reason our way to God, which is not really a fair critique of the West. But it's a common thing. You always see in the Eastern Orthodox apologetics the debate between St. Gregory Palamas and Barlaam of Calabria. And it's really not a fair fight between St. Gregory Palamas and Barlaam of Calabria. We really should be having a fight between St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Gregory Palamas. And even St. Thomas certainly would not say that you can reason your way to God. It's just not going to be a fair critique. It's probably not. I don't think I believe that there's a fair presentation of the spirituality of the West. I don't think that we're getting a fair shake. I mean, we have, the West is much more complex, all over the place spiritually in some ways, but I don't think it's getting a fair shake in that argument. There really is real spirituality, and there really is real concern about spiritual delusion in the West, and there really is concern about this, such as you hear the stories of Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque and the revelations of the Sacred Heart, and the concern that the superiors had about falling into these type of delusions and things like that. So we really do see that this is a Western thing as well, that Westerners do pray. They don't think you can reason your way to God. We are concerned about spiritual delusion. But ultimately, what we're seeing is that the Orthodox are specializing in a lot of this. They're really staying away from, they're staying away from these kind of sensory things. But the question becomes, Orthodoxy is very much focused on prayer and staying away from the faculties and in this kind of fully robust way. This kind of sobriety is what characterizes it. But how does it kind of have some substance? If we're thinking about it like a cave, it needs something to hold it together. And it can't float entirely freely because it needs to, it doesn't have this fully religious or sanctified way of dealing with the things of the world. I mean, it does certainly in its liturgy, but it doesn't want to go into the use of the faculties fully in a sanctified way. So I think that what happens is it has to lean on what we call incidental structures that aren't intrinsic to the faith. So things like ethnicity becomes very important because you need something, to support this mystical foundation of prayer. So you have things like why it's always, think about it, it's very odd, it's always Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox. It's not just like the Orthodox Church. It's always there's always this rootedness in ethnicity, which is good. It's incarnational. There's something good about that. But it's not like you don't have the Irish Catholic Church. I mean, you did have these ethnic enclaves, but you don't have the Irish Catholic Church, the French Catholic Church, the Italian Catholic Church, the German Catholic Church. I mean, you didn't have these as really separate things. There means something different to be a German Catholic versus French Catholic. And yes, there are historic personalities, certain saints. There are things like that. But something's different about it. There's this way in which there's kind of this extra load being placed on the ethnicity, and it kind of has this it kind of gives this deeper scaffolding than maybe it should. And it's not because it necessarily wants to be an ethnic religion. It's because it needs something to anchor the community in the world when we're not really fully going into the development of certain external structures like a papacy or even the full use of the faculties. So something incidental has to fill the gap. So that's kind of a way that we could think about this. But now let's take a look at maybe how Catholicism steps into the fray here. It's almost like Catholicism, again, we looked at how Protestantism had the intellectual stream, the kind of action theme, the kind of experience theme. And we saw how Orthodoxy kind of was sober about those things and pulled back into prayer. But Catholicism has to do more with covenant than it has to do with prayer. I mean, it has to do with both of those. But this kind of sense of covenant which allows for a kind of synthesis between the prayer and the other faculties. Because covenant means that we're grounded in a lot of things. Like we're grounded in the trustworthiness of God's fatherhood through time. And we're grounded in the nature of the papacy to give us a stable foundation. So with these things of faith in God's covenant through time, that we are the representatives of that covenant, and that practical grounding of, we know, okay, we don't need to have these incidental things. Like we don't just say incidental, okay, we're Russian, so we're Russian Orthodox. We're Greek, so we're Greek Orthodox. We say, no, we're Catholic because St. Peter is the head of the apostles, according to scripture and tradition. We have this kind of much more deep and sanctified understanding of the covenant and that agreement between God and the administration of that covenant. So we have this hierarchical and liturgical, we kind of understand where to go to church better. Because you could say, okay, well, there are times when the Russian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox are in schism, such as I believe at the current time of making of this video. So how do I know how to join the Orthodox Church? How do I know which side is the truly Orthodox Church? I can't, as far as I could tell. I mean, they might say it. We know that both of them are kind of the Orthodox Church because they're not different on their beliefs. But there's some problem with that. Why are they not in communion? They're just kind of out of communion because they're having a fight over something. That in this case, I think it was jurisdictional debate about whether this Ukrainian church could be in charge of itself. And so I think it was Ukrainian, may have been somewhere else. But the truth is, how come there's no one to solve these disputes? How come there's no one really administering the new covenant? And what we get in Catholicism is this much more clear understanding of who's in charge, the hierarchical, the social, political, and liturgical understandings. I know where to go to Mass because I know that the Masses that are in harmony with the bishops who are in union with the Bishop of Rome are the right Masses to go to. I don't need to wonder, okay, well, should I go to Greek Orthodox Church or Russian Orthodox Church? I know where the church is because the church is wherever Rome approves me going to Mass. And my local bishop says that Mass is valid, because there might be Masses that are not valid, different groups that are in different types of irregular or schismatic context. So there could be all kinds of things like that. So these are interesting problems. These are interesting problems that exist. These are interesting problems of all different kinds. And we have to understand these things. We have to come to this understanding that, hey, Catholicism, which has this deeper covenantal appreciation, allows us to have more trust. And trust has this effect of being more open. And that enables us to kind of not only have the sobriety of prayer, but also to engage with the faculties in addition to being sober. And so it's this covenantal Petrine rootedness that enables us to both be sober and prayerful and engaged in the faculties. And this is very interesting because we see then in practice that Catholicism does not distrust, for example, the intellect the same way Orthodoxy does. It doesn't throw itself, and it also doesn't throw itself into one faculty, like the Protestant things do. So we're going to go through. So Catholicism has an intellectual tradition, deep philosophy, theology, and systematic thought. It doesn't apologize for using reason fully, and it doesn't reduce faith to reason. That's against the Orthodox criticism. It just does not. We don't reduce faith and prayer to the use of reason, even though we fully use reason to engage with all these matters. Catholicism has a tradition of action. It does works of mercy, social engagement, care for the poor. But it doesn't, like the Protestant movements, reduce Christianity to activism in certain causes. Catholicism has an experiential spirituality with imaginative prayer, affective devotion, and mysticism. But it doesn't treat experiences like in the same way as Pentecostalism as this kind of self-validating badge of something. It kind of interprets them through obedience and larger structures of understanding the mystical life and so on and so forth, and has safeguards. So these are key differences that Catholicism, by being covenantally rooted, by having this deeper trust in its covenant identity and through the use of the Petrine office, the magisterium, and so on and so forth, and the fullness of that, or those organs of the functioning of the covenant, enables us to have the sobriety of prayer, both the full use of the faculties, and holds them all together in a coherent synthesis. And what's really interesting here is we see something really important. We see in the Protestant movement, we see that in Protestantism, there's this sense of like, I'm going to use one of these, I'm going to specialize in one of the faculties. In Orthodoxy, you're going to say, let's pray instead of engaging with the faculties. And in Catholicism, it's saying, hey, we're rooted in the covenant. We can pray and be sober and use the faculties. And so what we actually see here is that we see that Catholicism is reflecting the logic of the incarnation much more fully than Protestantism or Orthodoxy. We see that, Jesus doesn't reject the human faculties. He's fully divine and fully human. And we see this kind of parallel here, where Catholicism allows itself to be fully human, using the faculties, and fully divine, using prayer, and does that because it's this Petrine covenantal thing that's rooted in history and not rooted in scripture and tradition, and not in the accidents of history, I should say. So this is why we see Catholicism doesn't need ethnicity necessarily to ground itself, because its structure is theological, not incidental. The papacy is not just there because of just how history played out, but because of theological conclusions drawn from scripture, especially about the role of Peter. So Catholicism ends up being engaged in the world in a religiously meaningful way, rather than incidentally attached to it, like Orthodoxy, or specializing in certain things, like Protestantism. And you can see now, this is deeply important. We could see, there's certain things that really were essential to my struggles of faith. And this is with the Orthodox critiques of Catholic saints, like St. Francis of Assisi. Well, now, once you understand Catholicism properly, the Orthodox critiques of St. Francis just don't land anymore. You are now immune. You can see a way in which, well, if St. Francis is too warm, I'm not saying that, but there's a way in which the Orthodox style of spirituality is maybe too cold. It doesn't use the faculties enough. It has too much mistrust. You could say it the opposite way. And I'm not trying to say it to the extent, because I'm going to say the opposite. I'm going to not say that they are in prelest, but that they have a style of spirituality. The only mistake they're making is not that they're in spiritual delusion, but their accusation that others are. I think that the only thing that they are in is a state of spiritual fear or contraction. It's not like I say that it's even emotional fear. It's like that they are not fully using their faculties. And that can become a style of holiness. That could be a legitimate style of holiness. But it shouldn't be set up as opposition to the other styles of holiness. And it can become damaging if we take that to be the benchmark of the only way to be holy. Someone can emphasize, you can kind of major in the minors and still be playing music. But it doesn't mean that that's the type of song everyone should be playing. I think that we should major in the majors, play in the major scale. And it's very funny because there is almost like a shift in music. There is actually this musical difference of like major and minor scales between the East and the West that could kind of reflect this. But I think that it's really this thing of saying, hey, both things are beautiful. That's the Catholic position, rather than saying only the minor scale is beautiful. Only these emphasis of this kind of sobriety is beautiful. Well, I think that we need to be able to be open to everything. We need to really fully look at the pattern of the incarnation. And we see this as being borne out by the Catholic tradition, being able to go out and evangelize the world in a much more robust way than Orthodoxy has. We see this, I think this means that we could see that it's the true church. That's very, and it doesn't mean that everything about Orthodoxy is false, or even everything about Protestantism is false. There's good parts in a lot of these things. But Catholicism allows us to have this framework that lets us follow the full logic of the incarnation and be able to do that. And people, and again, we're saying ultimately, especially we're going back to this thing about the saints, people like St. Francis or St. Ignatius of Loyola, who fully use their emotions and their imagination, they look delusional to the Orthodox because they don't have a framework for the disciplined, sanctified engagement with the imagination and affect. But Catholicism does. And Catholicism shows that you can use imagination, emotion, and experience in a sober, ordered way without falling into delusion, which is why, again, St. Ignatius of Loyola, trusting figures like Saint Therese of Lisieux, affective figures like affective figures like Saint Francis of Assisi. These people are not in delusion. Nobody's imagining. Saint Ignatius doesn't think he's really going back in time to the crucifixion when he's doing imaginative prayer. He doesn't think Jesus is really talking to him from the cross when he's imagining Jesus talking to him from the cross. There's a structured, disciplined engagement of the faculties under obedience and doctrine and virtue and all these things in Catholicism, which enables you to fully embody and sanctify all the elements of the human person. And this is why this whole framework works. This doesn't show that Catholicism is true in some abstract sense. It shows you why Catholicism spiritually works, why Catholic saints make sense, and why the Catholic structure of life actually corresponds to the logic of the incarnation and the full structure of the human person, the full engagement with reality. So once again, we see this pattern. The Catholicism is coming out as the front runner. We see that Protestantism fully engages certain faculties, but fragments them and specializes. We see Orthodoxy preserving sobriety of prayer, but withdrawing from engagement in the other faculties. We see Catholicism being rooted in the covenant, knowing itself as this Petrine continuity and having all the correct organs of functionality, so that it's able to keep the sobriety of prayer and engagement of the faculties together. So again, we see this Goldilocks position coming about in Catholicism. And this brings us to an important thing, because we've seen Catholicism become the extension of the incarnation. But now the thing becomes that, how do we be Catholic? Because there's debates inside the Catholic Church. So we basically come down to that Catholicism is the true church. Now we're inside Catholicism. We see how Catholicism is the true church. The church founded by Jesus Christ. What a grace to be able to see, to be able to perceive in a logical way God's true church. I mean, that's a great thing. And, that's something that we should celebrate, being able to see God's true church on earth in a logical way. To have something like that, to be able to say, well, I see it. That's great. Doesn't mean you have to never have a doubt. Doesn't mean you can't have a doubt about it. But you have a clear perspective. It makes sense. Just does. Just sits there and makes sense. It doesn't need to defend itself. It makes perfect sense. It's the logic of the incarnation, fully played out. Anything that's weird about Catholicism, it's the extension of the logic of the incarnation. Why do you confess to a priest? It's the logic of the incarnation. Because Jesus came in the flesh. I talked to a guy. Why is the body and blood of Jesus? Because Jesus came in the flesh. It's flesh. It's like anything weird about Catholicism is always the logic of the incarnation, because it's always the fullness of the logic of the incarnation. That's what's happening. So it's the real heir to the incarnate Lord, because it's the full logic of the incarnation. Why do we have clear definitions of when sacraments work and when they don't? Well, because it's the logic of the incarnation. We're using the intellect fully. We're not just saying, okay, we kind of know, like in Orthodoxy. We're saying, no, we really know. We're really fully doing everything. It's always everything that's distinctive or criticized in Catholicism, whether, it's the things that Protestants criticize about Catholicism, such as, the saints. Well, why do we venerate the saints? Well, because Jesus came in the flesh. Now we have other people who we're honoring them. That's why we have their relics. That's why we have all this stuff. Everything that's weird is because it's more like the incarnation. In the same thing, like anything the Orthodox say, like, oh yeah, you're using your intellect too much. You have too much emotions. You have these things. All right, well, that's the incarnation. So anything that everybody is hitting Catholicism with sticks that say you look too incarnate, you look too fleshy, and what we're really doing is we're looking like the incarnate. Carne means meat, flesh. That's what we have, and that's our proof. So the things that are the criticisms are our badges of honor that make us look like Jesus. So, and again, Jesus is the one who is criticized too. So it's like the things that make us, and the things that make us different. We're the only church that's kind of stood against certain things that are, like there's certain things that we do and certain things that we say. We've stayed against the tide of things like, orthodoxy being permissive of things like divorce and contraception ultimately. And these things that have kind of held the tide against the culture in these ways, and we've kind of stood out in all these different ways. And it's amazing to see that, to see the things that make Catholicism different. And these are the things, and the variety that we have, all these different, the variety of our spiritualities, and, all these different devotions and all these things, which proceed from the fact that we have this connection to God and the trust to be able to go out and explore, like a secure attachment, like the baby, when it's securely attached to the mother, explores the room. And we see this in Catholicism, that we have this trust in God and the variety of devotions and variety of streams of philosophies and spiritualities, which is indicative of this health and this vibrancy. But of course, we have problems. We have many problems. And that's where we're going to go next, because there are many real shortcomings. We can't just be triumphalist about things. There are complexities with, especially in the modern church. There are all kinds of things that are challenges for people coming into the church, for people to look at, because we see, different scandals, especially the widely publicized sex abuse scandals. These are big problems. There's also many struggles and conflicts between factions, such as traditional factions, modernist factions, and kind of normal factions, and we need to make sense of the world. We need to make sense of this. So we can't afford to have this kind of, we can be blessed to see that Catholicism is the true church. But in that vision, we also have to account for these challenges and how to make sense of these challenges. So that's kind of our next task in this argument from reality. We have to make sense of what we're seeing. And again, this is always, it comes back to what this whole thing is about, which is about gaining accurate knowledge so we can fully invest ourselves in practice. And it's really this kind of tandem thing where the complexity that we're taking, the time to really understand these things, is going to yield a simplicity of life that we ultimately can have. We also can engage with our faculties fully, and we can understand how to do that. We gain this theoretical understanding so that we can gain practical freedom. That's how it all works. So let's dive right in. So what are the different brands of Catholicism that are there? We have to really understand that there's three main brands. And there's many more. There's going to be, you can divide up Catholicism, in all different ways. Like I had other methods in the old days of, you just can have all these charts that kind of recapitulate the spectrum of Christianity within Catholicism that has kind of the same flavors. You can really do that in great detail, and it's really interesting when you go into that, because you see in the modern church, you can kind of pick out, that guy is the guy who like mirrors that thing in Protestantism inside Catholicism. Oh, he's kind of bringing that into the Catholic synthesis. Look at that. You can do that with all kinds of different people, for better or worse, and in partial ways. And, you could say, okay, it's good. That guy's doing a pretty good job at that. Okay, it's interesting. There's all kinds of stuff going on like that. But the thing is that ultimately there's three big things that I want to just emphasize here, because especially we really proved in the last section that Catholicism won by being the best reflection of the Incarnation. And that's kind of the reality that we're arguing from. So when we look at the contemporary church, we immediately see three main brands of Catholicism. And each one has something important to say. Each one is reacting to something real. But not all of them succeed in holding the whole synthesis together. And in fact, you're going to see how actually none of these really are going to hold the whole synthesis together. And let's just kind of begin with the part that I kind of like the best in some ways. In some ways I like this the best. And it's because there's some really important things here. We really need a foundation in this. This is really important. We can't throw this out. So let's start with what's called traditionalist Catholicism. And this has few different flavors. This has flavors where it's like, hey, we're really not part of the mainstream church, like in Sede Vacantis, where it's like, hey, there's no pope. But the popes fell. It's all over. I've been popes for many years, but we're still Catholic because that's the real church, and we're going to hide over here. Hey, there's an intellectual coherence there. They've made things make sense in their own way. They're over there. They're trying to do it. Let's give them the judgment of charity there. They're sacrificing a lot. They're trying to make sense of it. They're trying to do their best. They think there's no pope. They're over here. Then you have people like, the SSPX is kind of in this canonically irregular status, whatever that, we can argue about that all day. Then we have, kind of groups that are Latin Mass Catholics who are within the visible hierarchy. And whatever spectrum we're on here, the whole thing here is the understanding that the old way is better. That the church used to know who she was. The traditional liturgy was deeper, more ancient, and more reverent. And that's true to a large degree. The spirituality was more grounded. The theology was clearer. And somehow around the time of Vatican II, things really started to loosen up, flatten out, and drift out of whack. And there's a lot that's correct in that synthesis. There's a lot that's good stuff. They're absolutely right. The church cannot afford to lose connection to its traditions. Tradition matters, liturgy matters, continuity matters, and depth matters. We can't reinvent the church in every generation and expect it to survive. There's a real danger in novelty for its own sake. And they're also right to notice that certain modern movements don't sit easily within the older spiritual grammar. So, for example, things like the charismatic movement or certain modern devotional styles or practices can feel disconnected. Things like centering prayer, things like that can feel disconnected from the church's historical forms. And they can also see that the older liturgy is really older, richer, and more deeply rooted, and that the modern liturgy is disconnected from that tradition in some substantial ways. The traditionalist instinct is not wrong, but the problem is what traditionalism ends up doing in practice is it treats development itself as suspect. It can start to act as though the church can kind of go back, freeze a historical moment, and guard that moment against everything new. And that's where it stops following the logic of the incarnation. And the problem is that the church's tradition has always developed, doctrine has always deepened, practices have always been refined, and the saints that have even been paragons of tradition are actually also innovators. People like Saint Therese of Lisieux, they developed doctrine, they developed spirituality, they found the new she founded the little waves, new. Saint Maximilian Kolbe developed the theology of the Blessed Mother in his writings. They weren't just repeating formulas, they were thinking about the faith in new ways. So traditionalism, when it becomes reactive, isn't actually as traditional as it thinks, or as traditional as the saints that they honor. It becomes a response to modern chaos, rather than a continuation of the pattern of the incarnation or of organic growth. And while we might say that the changes in the liturgy and spirituality in Vatican II era are a disruption, we could also say that the traditionalism is a reaction. So their concern as traditionalists for continuity is valid. Suspicion of development, though, ends up cutting against the very pattern that the church has always followed. So traditionalism has real insight, but it doesn't give us the capacity and the technology and the principles for full synthesis that are bound up with the incarnation itself. Now, on the other side, we have, what we would call the spirit of Vatican II, the modernist Catholicism. We're going to just kind of use those popular terms, not that I'm trying to demean anybody, but that's the way it's spoken about. This approach kind of says the world has changed, the church needs to change with it. We need to be open and inclusive. Morality has to evolve. The church is kind of out of step with the times. Spirituality, we can kind of borrow from different tradition. The old boundaries are too rigid. Let's focus on dialogue, coexistence, accompaniment, getting along. There's something true here. The church has to speak to the modern world. The church has to evangelize the current culture and not an imaginary culture. And the church needs to go to the margins. The church needs to bring healing to those who are hurting, to speak truth into those places of people bound in all kinds of suffering. We need to go to the people that are looked at as like weird. We need to go be with the homeless, the sick, people, and especially even going to these groups that Christians kind of tend to have this thing of like, okay, you could there's like these things of dealing with the LGBTQ community. There's these things where it's like, okay, Christians have this history of, okay, if people are gay or lesbian, they tend to have problems, with finding how to fit in there. And, if people, are transgender, there's these issues, it's like, so we have to be able to go to these groups and to be able to really reach out. And these things, to go to the margins to be dealing with people of different races, different cultures, different sexual orientations. These things are things that need to happen. But the problem is, what happens is that as we're seeking to evangelize the modern world, what happens is we dissolve all commitment to any principles that make any coherence of this, and even the principles that could bring healing and wholeness to the people that we're reaching out to. Instead of development, we get a kind of replacement, and instead of engagement, we get an accommodation of things that might not fit with the faith. And instead of a synthesis, you get this kind of vague tolerance and pluralism, where everything is allowed and nothing is clearly taught. Everybody's welcomed, but nobody's welcomed to anything at all. So it's like, you may welcome everybody, but what are you welcoming them into? You may accept everybody, but on what basis? And so you're kind of getting this kind of sense whereas we saw, in the traditionalist thing, we actually saw an echo of orthodoxy. We saw something like, hey, a sobriety that said, oh no, we're not going into all those faculties fully. We're not going off into all these directions. No, we're not doing that. We're just holding back. We didn't follow the incarnation fully, that logic there fully. But we see in the modernism something more like Protestantism, something that's like this lack of sobriety about things. We're getting caught into all these different movements and all these different things, and new thoughts, new behaviors, new experiences. We're going off in all those different directions, and we see that loss of sobriety in the faculty. So we see that, in a way, traditionalism is kind of like orthodoxy. Modernism is a little bit like Protestantism. There's ways in which they're all a little bit like those things too. It's kind of not. There's kind of some analogies we can make between all these things. We could say that traditionalism is like Protestantism because it doesn't always follow the hierarchy. We could say that modernism is like orthodoxy because it allows some flexibility with economia, allowing for divorce, allowing for this. Okay, there's some ways in which you can make some analogies. I'm not in any way trying to offend Orthodox people by saying yes, that Catholic modernism is like orthodoxy, but what I'm saying is that there are ideological parallels or functional parallels that can be drawn between these things in some ways. And what I'm really trying to say is that, when you put these things inside the Catholic context, there's ways in which they resonate differently with all the other aspects. That it's not clean, like a clean resonance with one thing or another, but we could see similar patterns that we've seen in previous levels of the argument. And that's not accidental. Again, I always come back to this is not an accidental model. This is a model that's describing real territories, and these parallels are not arbitrary or links that are being made arbitrarily. These are real links of the real territory that we're really describing with this whole big thing that's part of the big cruciform synthesis, and so on and so forth. Let's get back to the matter at hand. The thing is, you ended up seeing two things. You saw traditionalism, which was saying, hey, I don't want any of this new stuff. I want the old stuff. Modernism is, hey, I want the new stuff, not the old stuff. Okay, neither of those are a coherent synthesis of what Catholicism is. So what's the answers here? Let's try the normal, conservative, parish life Catholicism. We could call this conservative Catholicism, which we could say is not the spirit of Vatican II, but the letter of Vatican II. The approach is kind of like, this is the hermeneutic of continuity, whereas the other people more or less take more or less the hermeneutic of rupture. There's a problem that's gone on. The church is kind of ruptured around the Vatican II era in some way, and they're taking that thing, and this is the hermeneutic of continuity. We're going to say, hey, Vatican II is not the problem itself. The problem is how it's interpreted. So let's take the documents seriously, read them in continuity with the tradition, and live normal parish life as Catholics without falling into either extremes of traditionalism or modernism. And there's a real value here, too. This position is trying to be faithful, it's trying to be balanced, trying to avoid reaction on either side, and in many ways, this is where most ordinary Catholics live. Here's the issue. It doesn't create an actual coherent, ordered synthesis of Catholicism or of parish life. When you look at parish life, when you don't find it as a true synthesis, you find a bit of a mishmash. In a normal parish, you might sometimes have someone come in, and do a retreat that might be a little bit new agey. They're not going to even notice it, though, because they're not aware of these techniques in some ways. Then you might have the charismatic prayer meeting one night. Then you might have a centering prayer meeting doing something. Then you might have the conservative apologetics talk being given. You might have, St. Paul Street evangelization going on. You might have a social justice committee doing its own thing over here. And all of this can exist side by side without a coherent unifying vision. And different parishes may have a little bit more of this flavor, and other ones may have a little bit more of that flavor. But each piece might make sense of it on its own, but together they just don't cohere. And that's the real problem with the modern church, or what we might call the conservative synthesis, is that it's not that there are these different emphases, but that there's no articulated synthesis so how they belong together. And so traditionalism has a kind of coherence in itself, modernism has a kind of coherence in itself, and conservatism has a kind of coherence in itself. But together, these competing voices, they don't yet compute into something that makes sense with the incarnation, or even make sense of all of Catholicism and all it can be. And they tell us something important. That these positions taken by themselves are not the synthesis that we're looking for. As they say in Star Wars, these are not the droids you're looking for. But if they were, they would have already resolved the tensions that we're trying to solve, rather than just reproducing them in the Catholic key. So, what this means is that we're not done yet. We need a way of putting this all together, a way that preserves tradition without freezing it, and engages the world without dissolving the tradition, and uses all the faculties without just specializing and fragmenting them. And that's where we're headed next. And so, what we want to say here is that we need to have We need the best of both worlds, and that's the way we need the best of all worlds, and that's how we're going to find what looks like the incarnation most fully, and what is the full expression of true Catholicism, authentic Catholicism. So the traditionalists are right. Everybody needs more connection to tradition. But when we look at how traditionalism works, we see that's not part of a bigger system. It's kind of upsetting the tradition as opposed to development. So it doesn't operate like the incarnation. It doesn't take on flesh. It doesn't say, how do I enter into these fleshly approaches and redeem them? It says, no, I don't want any of this flesh. Keep it out. It keeps the charismatics out, keeps the centering prayer people out, keeps it all out. Keep it out. It never asks the deeper question of what's going on here. How could this be redirected? How could this be repurposed? How could this be reintegrated? Which is the logic of redemption, the logic of, and of course, these things also, we're talking about incarnation here, but a lot of this has to do with crucifixion as well. We can't really separate any of these realities, any of these mysteries of Christ from each other. You start to see, okay, well, the church has to die to itself in order to bring, it has to change form, not with that hermeneutic of rupture, like it dies entirely, but there's a difference. There's some differences when we have, there's times in history when there's kind of a bit of a difference. So there's a bit of death and resurrection, not just death, not just a continuity of life. There's something going on. It's not just like in the conservative synthesis, it's like, yeah, it's all fine, nothing changed. That's not true. It's not the thing of, everything changed. That's what the traditionalists and the modernists are both saying, kind of in different ways. Hey, it's great that it changed. That's modernists. No, it changed. That's traditionalists. There's a way in which there's incarnation, the ministry, crucifixion and resurrection. We have this whole mystery of Christ, not just rupture or continuity. We need hermeneutics that have to do with the mysteries of Christ, not hermeneutics that just have to do with random political categories of rupture or continuity. And so we have to have the thing of saying, hey, what's the cross of it? Christ was reconciling all things to himself on the cross. How can we live this out? How Christ was blending, he is human and divine, he's reconciling things to himself in the incarnation. How does traditionalism find its place in that? Not say, hey, keep it all out. No. Traditionalism is it's like that central part onto which things need to be glued. It needs to find its purpose. It's not about getting rid of tradition. We have to understand, what's tradition for? Tradition is for the anchoring of the thing. Tradition is kind of for the anchoring of everything, for that ballast, for that weight that we need on the ship, on the bark of Peter. We need that weight of traditionalism. And we could say that, there's something good about a sail. Sails, modernism is good in a sense. We have to catch the winds of the time. So does the spirit of the age. We have to catch that. There's some good in that. And then we have the conservatism about where are we right now? Okay, the steering wheel. You need a steering wheel and the rudder and all that system. You need the ballast and you need the sail to get the bark of Peter, the Catholic Church, to be going where it should be going, to be authentically what it is, to be a fully functioning boat. So you need the best of all these things. But I'm running away with that too much. But let's focus on the traditionalists some more. Let's say, okay, because here's the thing: when you look at it, they're trying to keep everything out. They love St. Thomas Aquinas, but St. Thomas Aquinas himself took in Aristotle and was not traditional in the sense he was not traditional in that he took a new material and he was synthesized it, he reworked it, he baptized it. So the thing is here, St. Thomas is not, he's not a traditionalist. Traditionalism knows what St. Thomas said, agrees with what St. Thomas said, but doesn't do what St. Thomas did. That's why traditionalism is not as traditional in the deepest sense, and why it doesn't match the logic of the incarnation, and why it cannot be the foundation of the future of Catholicism. But we desperately need those elements of it. That's kind of the roots, but it's not the whole tree. And so now let's look at the conservatives. The conservatives say, yes, Vatican II is good. Okay, they're not traditionalists, and they're not liberals. They try to stay in the middle, and it looks promising, but really, they're not going fully either way. Jesus is fully human, fully divine, but the conservative synthesis ends up looking like half human, half divine. They're like, we'll take half the tradition and half the new developments, so we'll get balance. No. Well, that doesn't really work so great, because you just end up with bits and pieces of the new biblical emphasis from great folks like Scott Hahn. They take maybe the more balanced and healthy elements of the charismatics. But they'll also have, we have some more social justice, some more activism, pro-life, maybe some more social justice, depending on the flavor of the priest or the parish. But we're not going to go deeply into the Latin Mass or those things. We're still going to but it's kind of not the best of both worlds. It's just half of both worlds. So this is not the full logic of the incarnation. And so the tradition of the church can't be purely traditionalist, but it can obviously be conservative, because that's not even matching the logic of the incarnation. It's almost like the traditionalists are like the roots, and the conservative thing is kind of like the trunk. It's kind of like it's got something to it, but it's not something on its own. It doesn't do the job. And we can now look at the liberals. And they basically say, hey, we're going to break with tradition. We don't want to worry too much about the old forms. We want to be open. We want to be flexible. We want to be welcoming. Morality needs to evolve. We're out of touch with the times. We've got to welcome everybody. We can have all these new spiritualities, and we can go really far with this. We can have Protestant-style services. We could have ecumenical worship. We can borrow from Eastern religions. We can just do an Eastern meditation. We can really have this overwhelming emphasis on social justice issues and different issues of the times and different causes. You can kind of get your hands in everything here. But the problem is by going after all these fruits, you lose touch with the roots. And it reaches for these fruits in a way that makes them into forbidden fruits, because they eat in the wrong way at the wrong time. And we go out on every limb without staying connected to the trunk and the roots, and it becomes disconnected from the core of what it means to be Catholic. But to be fair, there's something important. There's something good about wanting to bring everything together under one roof. Something good about an ecumenical spirit, something good about wanting to value everybody and go to the margins and meet people who've been condemned. Because Christ was condemned. Christ went to the margins, he went to the lepers, he went to the outcasts, he brought people in, and that's real, that's beautiful. The problem here is that this approach becomes only margins, it loses the center, and once again only reflects one side of Christ, the human nature, without holding it in full union with the divine nature. It says, hey, everything that's human is fine, doesn't need to be changed, doesn't need to be redeemed, doesn't need to be reformed. No, it's about taking everything that's human and uniting it to the divine nature so that it's purified, elevated, and transformed. So now you can see the pattern. The traditionalists are kind of like roots that are just roots. The conservatives are like a trunk that's just a trunk. The modernists are just like going after all these fruits up here. They're all fruits and all branches, disconnected from everything. So what we need is the whole thing. We need a whole tree. We need this whole tree of life. That's what we need. You need the whole boat. You need the ballast, the steering wheel and the rudder, and the sail. That's how you go somewhere. So the traditionalists are more like an image of divine nature, but with little engagement with the human. The conservatives hover somewhere in the middle, half divine, half human. The liberals emphasize human nature strongly, but lose touch with the divine stuff. What we really want is something that does the best of all three. From the traditionalists, we want the deep contact with traditionalism, that full icon of engagement with the divine nature. From the conservatives, we need that continuity and acceptance of Vatican II and the present church and fidelity to the visible hierarchy. From the liberals, we need this willingness to go to the margin and engage with everything that is authentically human. And we need to have all these things working together as one system, like one tree, like one boat. They need to have the different roles that they all work together. So you have the liberal stuff is bringing in everything that's authentically human. The conservative stuff is that we are united to the visible hierarchy. And the traditional stuff is that we know how, when we're bringing all this stuff into the visible church, how do we reform it in light of what has been revealed? And so that makes it a coherent system rather than an incoherent system. And so we have to have this kind of all working together in this authentic Catholic synthesis. So this is what the future of the church has to look like. This is the way the logic of the incarnation has to play out. Like this is really how it all fits together. We have to make everything in an orderly synthesis and not into a mishmash. We have to fully live out this. And so we could see that, the type of Catholicism that we want to have, and we can really see, how in the next section, we're going to kind of just bring everything together more in the home stretch, because we can see a really good picture now of where we want to be, what Catholicism is all about, how to make sense of these problems within Catholicism and these tensions within Catholicism. And it doesn't mean that any of this is easy, but it means that we live in the struggle and the light and the life of Christ, which is not always easy, but has all of the joyful, sorrowful, and glorious mysteries to it. It's kind of this very interesting thing. And so we've seen now that Catholicism is the true religion, and also how to understand how to make sense of it. So we're going to move on in the next section to some kind of different ways of kind of circling back through some of the territory we've had to kind of flesh out some of the and deepen our understanding of some of those things that brought us into this territory and into these questions to begin with.